Welcome everybody. We're about to start in a minute or so, so just giving time for people to arrive. Okay, Christina, I think we can go now. Well, a warm welcome to everybody and thank you for being with us this afternoon for what I hope is going to be a stimulating, lively, interesting discussion. I should say that this event is being recorded and it will go up on the Community Land Scotland website for others to watch it sometime later. So welcome to those who are going to participate that way as well. Now, today's webinar has been scheduled for 1 hour. It's been organised by Community Land Scotland to discuss the recently published and independent research entitled Plantation Slavery and Landownership in the West Highlands and Islands. The research was published by Community Land Scotland and is an independent contribution to their series of discussion papers on land and the common good, which is up again on their website. I'm Peter Peacock and I've been asked to chair the webinar, and it's a great pleasure to welcome our panel for the event. First, the authors of the published research, Dr Iain MacKinnon of Coventry University, but hailing from Skye originally, and Dr Andrew Mackillop from Glasgow University and hailing from the island of Harris originally. So the two authors actually come from the West Highlands and Islands, and they'll shortly talk us through the research. We also have joining our panel, Dr Jennifer Melville, who leads the National Trust for Scotland's project on Facing Our Past, and she'll give reflections from her experience and perspective on the research findings and her own experience of dealing with these sorts of issues. And finally, Dr Calum MacLeod, the Policy Director of Community Land Scotland, who will give a Community Land Scotland perspective on the research. And if anybody joining us wants to ask a question, then please use the Q&A facility at the bottom of your screen. And you can leave any question that you want there, and we'll try and get to those slightly later in the webinar. And for those who just want to leave a comment, if you use the chat facility again at the bottom of your screen, and you can do that. And we'll try and, as I say, get to questions slightly later. Now, the published research has drawn a great deal of interest, both domestically and indeed internationally. Today's webinar has got around about 100 participants. And it's been the subject, the research has been the subject of a number of news and current affairs articles, of TV coverage, and even a lively short debate in the Scottish Parliament just a couple of weeks ago. Now, I should say that perhaps oddly, this research may have some origins in Valencia, where Iain MacKinnon and I once discussed the issue of land ownership patterns in the Highlands and Islands and any possible relationship there might be with the proceeds of slavery. So Iain, I want to come to you first to start us off in today's proceedings and give an overview of the research, what its broad findings are, and where it's led your own thoughts. So over to you, Iain.
Thanks, Peter. And I think on behalf of myself and Andrew, would just like to thank Community Land Scotland and Peter and Calum in particular for their support in helping the report come into being. So we began with quite a narrow research question, which was centred on the compensation fund that was set up in 1833 when slavery was abolished to compensate slave owners for the loss of their slaves as property. And the question was whether any of that money was used to buy land in the Highlands and Islands from which people were subsequently cleared. But as the research got underway and the scale of the connections of slavery beneficiaries and land ownership in the West Highlands and Islands became apparent, the research question changed into a more general one of just trying to understand the range and the scale of connections. And we defined slavery wealth in two categories: direct wealth, which we categorized as slave owners and slave traders, and indirect, which are members of their families and people involved in some ancillary industries such as sugar or tobacco trading or cotton, those kinds of commercial activities. The initial method was to compare two databases, so that one database set up by the Legacy of British Slaveries project at University College London. They compiled a comprehensive list, online searchable list with biographical information in many cases of all those who'd received compensation. And that's since been expanded to include many others involved in slavery in the Caribbean before 1833. So that was on the one hand, and on the other hand, a list of estate purchases in the early 19th century compiled by Tom Devine as part of his work on land ownership change in the Highlands and Islands. And Tom Devine's work has been really crucial in helping to set the scene for the arrival of slavery money in terms of the report's analysis. And Devine talked about a revolution in land ownership that was happening in the West Highlands and Islands in that period. And so we've been looking at the key role of slavery money in facilitating that revolution. But as Devine said in his own piece, that his list of purchases wasn't exhaustive, and it soon became clear that there were other purchases that had happened as well. So that involved an expanded method of then looking through contemporary newspapers, estate papers, and especially the say sign records for the counties of Ross and Inverness. We maintained Devine's focus on the West Highlands and Islands, and were able to define and establish an acreage for the area from the islands, from Jura in the south to Lewis in the north, and the west mainland parishes of the counties of Inverness and Ross. And that enabled us to establish an acreage, a fairly reliable acreage for the area, and to establish then the proportion of land that came into the ownership of slavery beneficiaries. So the findings were, we found 63 significant purchases of land between 1726 and 1939 made by slavery beneficiaries. That's increasing since the report's published. It's now 65. I'm sure there are others out there as well. Most of those purchases took place between 1790 and 1855, which Eric Richards has said is the main period of the Highland clearances. And the peak of purchases occurred in the years immediately following the establishment of the compensation fund of £20 million in 1834 terms, £16 billion in today's terms for slave owners in the slavery abolition legislation. Estate purchasers who were direct beneficiaries of that fund, so that's not including children and grandchildren, received £110 million of compensation. And that those are people who went on to buy land in the Highlands and Islands. And a total of 1.14395 acres were bought. And additionally, some estates were bought more than once, and that acreage is more than 1/3 of the total area of the West Highlands and Islands as we defined it. And that's a conservative figure, as the acreage of some estates hasn't yet been found. And when traditional families who were already landowners, they didn't buy land, but developed direct or indirect connections with slavery, are considered, the total acreage goes up to more than 1.8 million. And I think arguably that should be over 2.2 million, because for some reason we didn't include Mackenzie of Seaforth in that figure, perhaps because the family lost the land. But if we take them into account, it's well over 60%. And again, that's a conservative figure. At least 5,000 people were cleared by the new slavery elite landlords. And when the traditional families are taken into account, that goes into the tens of thousands. One qualification is that the report only focuses on land purchase. In addition to land purchase, additional connections with slavery beneficiaries are large scale leasing of land in terms of shooting estates, land being used as collateral for loans that were made by slavery beneficiaries, sometimes followed by purchase, and the establishment of fishing stations to exploit the market for salt herring, which was sold to plantations in the Caribbean for feeding slaves. So a conclusion is that the scale of purchase and ownership by slavery beneficiaries means that their influence is something we have to bear in mind when discussing the revolution in land ownership that took place in the early 19th century, and more broadly in the historical development of the Highlands and Islands since the 18th century. And I'm going to hand over to Andrew now to elaborate on that a little bit more. Andrew.
Okay, well, can I just thank you first of all, Iain, and as you say, handing over to Andrew now, and who'll talk from a historian's perspective, with I think concentrating a bit too on the concentration of land ownership and some of the cultural dimensions that this question raises. So, Andrew, over to you.
Thank you very much, Peter. And could I just echo Iain's thanks to Community Land Scotland, to Calum, yourself, Peter, for showcasing their research. And I would also like to pay tribute to Iain himself. About the guts of this research is in fact largely, if not exclusively, Iain's. What I want to talk about in a sense are the implications or the cultural politics that surround the surprising stats, to put it mildly, that Iain has just articulated to you all. In a sense, what we're talking about here is how do we understand the cultural politics of the nexus between slavery-derived capital and questions of land ownership in the Highlands. And what I want to do is run through what the report, in a sense, highlights are the key ways we might dissect that and suggest some of the implications that flow from that. In a sense, the cultural politics of the link between slavery capital and wealth can be described under what we've taken to calling the 5 Ds. The first D is displacement. What we are seeing here is the displacement of capital from a key part of the world economy that is, in a sense, being disinvested in. As Britain moves against coercive labour systems, essentially the capital moves from one sector of the economy into the other. Now, it moves into lots of them. It moves into shipbuilding, it moves into banking, it moves into railways. What we're seeing here is the regional expression of that capital displacing into the land market in the Highlands. Now, it's worth pointing out that the Highlands post 1815-20, and certainly by the 1830s and 40s, is a regional economy that's vulnerable and lacking resilience. Lots of landlords are going to the wall. The result is this elite with slavery-derived capital are gaining acreage at bargain basement prices. So the first element of displacement is essentially a rational economic calculus that moves slave wealth into landowning wealth. The second D we describe as disguise. What we are seeing here is the laundering, quite consciously, of slavery-derived wealth through the process of land ownership. Remember, Britain is turning increasingly abolitionist in culture, as indeed are most transatlantic societies. Association with slavery is increasingly morally frowned upon, if not deemed to be outright abhorrent and repugnant. Those with slavery wealth are looking for ways to launder it, and land, particularly land in the Highlands, is useful for that cultural objective. If you think about it, land versus the type of wealth we're talking about will serve a very useful function. Land is understood to be natural. This wealth is man-made. Land is stable, enduring. Colonial economies are known for their unstable, transitory nature. The products of land are natural and steady. The products of slavery are deemed to be, in a sense, luxury and prone to fluctuation. So land serves a particular function where it changes the nature of the capital. It changes it from its artificial, man-made and unstable processes into something much more acceptable. That's the disguise element. Displacement is where, in a sense, from displacement to disguise, you move to distraction. What you're seeing here is also the cultural process by which that capital can be reconfigured and displayed or produced in new ways. The Highlands is in a region which is going through a particular cultural transition. It's now considered wild, authentic, traditional, and therefore landowners who hold acreage in that region can, in a sense, bask in these associations. We know of guilt by association. What we have here is virtue by association. They're building up a new image of themselves as landed families with the attributes of traditional land holding. That's the distraction element. The last element is display. Now that you have your capital transformed, you can now use the capital to transform the land. You undertake conspicuous display of this new traditional virtuous capital. You start to build conspicuous baronial castles. You invest in new types of manicured gardened landscapes. You invest in new types of local activity, railways, hunting, shooting, etc. In other words, displacement leads to disguise, leads to distraction, leads to display. What we're fundamentally seeing here is land being used to change capital and then capital to change land. The implications are probably to be understood briefly in two ways. This injection of slavery-derived wealth into the West Highlands and Islands essentially it continues a process of land monopoly land ownership. This period of the 1820s, 30s and 40s might have seen, and does up to a point, see a breakup of the old, really large landholding structures. But the influx of wealth, particularly the period Iain mentioned of the 1820s, 30s, 40s and 50s, probably mitigates against that. The average acreage produced by those with slavery-derived wealth was 25,000 acres. In some cases, it's as much as 99,000 acres. So slavery-derived wealth is helping at least slow down the breakup of the very large estates. Some estates like Glenelg could just shift over whole scale. So we have the maintenance of monopoly land ownership. We also have, crucially as a last point, the way in which this slavery wealth exacerbates the tendency towards monopoly land use. Remember, these estates are playing a culturally, a role that we can describe as trophy and display. You use not just the landed house or the great house, you use the whole landscape to display those attributes of your capital. That means turning land over whole scale to particularly display orientated use, hunting, fishing, shooting. In other words, colonial wealth perpetuates, exacerbates and increases the use of land in mono-dimensional ways, in obvious contradistinction to the old Balchian pre-clearance systems, which had seen localized, socially orientated use of land. So what we have in effect is the tendency for capital to be changed by land, for land to then change capital, and for those effects to be twofold: the continuation or the perpetuation of monopoly land use, and the use of this capital to facilitate, hasten the use of land in monopoly ways. So these were some of the key ways we thought about the cultural politics, Peter.
Good. Andrew, thank you very much. That was absolutely fascinating to get that objective analysis from a historian's perspective. Can we now move on to Jennifer Melville to give some reflections? As I said earlier, Jennifer leads the work of the National Trust for Scotland on facing our past. And I guess the clue to that work is very much in the title of it, Jennifer. So over to you to give us your perceptions on this and from your experience of doing the project that you're doing.
Yes, thanks very much, Peter. I'm just going to put a couple of links into the chat for people to get a better idea of the sort of things we've been doing. But in essence, essentially, we've had a very similar exercise to the one that that Andrew and Iain have been doing, in the sense that we have been working on the subject of slavery for well over a decade now, and we were certainly aware of the connections with enslavement through our West Coast properties in and around Glasgow, and of course the famous story of Scipio Kennedy being at Culzean. But I think in the same way with the land, similarly with our properties in the States, we had no idea of the impact really until the UCL Slavery Compensation website, which has been a complete game changer for everyone. So I think what that did was make us realise that how slavery impacted on the whole of Scottish society, as you've rightly said, from people producing salted herring, but also the linen weavers. So when we redevelop House of Dun, we're marrying that with the Angus Folk collection, and we'll be able to tell the story of the impact of linen growing and selling it to be worn by slaves, enslaved people, and that was very much to the benefit of the ordinary working people in the Angus area particularly. So I suppose the unique situation the National Trust for Scotland is in is the diversity of our collections and estates, and how we can tell those stories in myriad different ways, really. And for me particularly, I can't thank Iain and Andrew enough for the way their research has enlarged the opportunities for us to do that into the landed estates. So for example, just last week, we're doing a redevelopment at Corrishallach Gorge. And I realised, of course, that that's part of an estate. It's part of the Braymore estate. And Iain and Andrew's work has made us all realise that that's yet one more of our properties which has been purchased at some point or other. We're not quite sure yet when, until we look at the say signs, which we'll be doing soon, exactly when that happened, but we are aware of that. So I think the other thing the Trust has is the really amazing opportunity to impact on the population. So we're doing that at the moment digitally, and one of the links I've put up are all the narratives that we're posting about particular properties and stories as we do our research, but also that we can do it in a visceral way in our properties. Of course, we don't have labels like a museum or gallery would, but we have wonderful guides who can impart these stories. So we're looking at diverse ways of doing that at the properties through creative interventions, community engagement, and enhanced guiding. And that could either take the form of being part of the normal guided experience or something special. So for example, one of my colleagues who's worked a lot in the Southern United States museums is developing guidance on how to interpret pianos, and many of our properties have pianos, in terms of the rare woods, the ivory and so on, that form a piano. So its physical structure can tell you an awful lot about society. And I think that's really interesting. But I suppose my big caveat to all of this is that everything needs to be grounded on really, really thorough research. And there's no point just assuming that money that a family had was actually used for the property. In many cases, we have properties that we suspect were enhanced through marriage and dowries that came to people, and I'm discovering evidence of that. But a classic example of that is Elizabeth Bailey, who married into the Brodies of Brodie, and shortly after the marriage, the house was enhanced. And we know that the family, the Brodie family, were having financial difficulties before that. That said, I think we need to be extremely careful about jumping to assumptions, and the National Trust in England have been caught out recently with actual factual errors in their findings on, for example, Lord Curzon. And just today, in fact, I saw a piece which one of my colleagues posted on Ham House, and how perhaps the evidence that they've posted is incorrect. So I suppose my big message is to be extremely thorough in the research, and also to be very sensitive, in our case, to donor families and the sensitivities of some of our conservative members of staff, conservative with a small c, and donor families. So I suppose what I'm taking is what Giovanni Vitelli of the Hunterian has described as a quiet approach, a measured approach. And yesterday, in fact, just to sum up, I received an email from somebody who's just given us an anonymous £5,000 donation. And he has said that he's talking about in fact, about Hugh Miller, but convinced that no one is infallible, and that we should be careful of judging anyone through the eyes of any one generation. When negative judgments are made, we should focus on the sin rather than attacking the sinner, and fully acknowledge the person's more positive contributions to society as well. So the approach I'm taking is that this is expanding the way we can interpret our properties and estates, which are palimpsests, really. There's a many layered approach we can take to our properties. And I think that's actually very exciting, that we can be honest and truthful about how these properties were acquired, but we can get away from the previously very patriarchal, linear approach to telling a story, which ultimately is quite boring. And you would think, why would you want to go back if you've heard that particular story? Let's instead open up the properties to many different narratives which enrich everyone's understanding. So I think that's probably enough from me just now.
Great, thank you very much, Jennifer. And we're going to come back and pick up on some of these points shortly. Finally, I want to ask Calum MacLeod, who's the Policy Director of Community Land Scotland, to give a perspective kind of coming from someone who's actively involved in current land debates in Scotland, and perhaps some of the connections between those current debates and that history. Calum, over to you.
Well, thanks very much, Peter. And can I begin just by saying in Gaelic, if I may, given the region where we are, Falchik on a Chanya Bahaki on the house mythology, will Hulutunya Codin, so be Dima and Kuspatha, Famal Hen, Fisak and thank welcome to you all to be here at this webinar and to discuss a topic which is hugely important, I think, in terms of our understanding of the the way in which, as Iain and Andrew's research has explained very clearly, the linkages between plantation slavery and land ownership have helped to form and shape and continue to have distant but very significant echoes in terms of land relationships in the contemporary period. And I think Jennifer made a really important point there, many important points, but a really important point in terms of the connection between what has been and what is now, but also to look at that in a very open and honest way, and to think about ways in which we can acknowledge these complex, often contentious and highly controversial relationships, but by stepping back to look at them from a contemporary lens, we can see more and understand more, in fact, in terms of the way in which these relationships have shaped our understanding of land in terms of its ownership and its use very critically. And I think Andrew kind of built on that very much in terms of the 5 Ds that he mentioned. Now, from Community Land Scotland's perspective, we were very pleased to publish this research as the first in our discussion paper series on land for the common good. And the aim of that discussion paper series is very much to inform and explain just the complex relationships with regard to land ownership and land use, and the whole issue of land reform itself, which, if we take the Land Reform Review Group's definition of that from 2014, is about changes to land ownership and land use in the public interest. Now, clearly the public interest is a very important factor in relation to all of this. And if we skip back through the centuries to 1833 and 1834, it was clearly seen as in the public interest at that point to have that slavery compensation fund in place to compensate slave owners in relation to their loss of property. But the agenda has moved on, obviously, in many ways since then. But the research is really important from a historical perspective, of course, because it actually sheds light in quite eye-watering detail in terms of the extensive relationships between that slavery-derived capital and land relations there. So that's very significant. And that was kind of echoed as well, I think, in the recent parliamentary debate on a motion tabled by Alistair Allen MSP, which was commending the research and acknowledging issues there. There is not, frankly, although there's been very commendable research undertaken by various people on this area in general, what I think this research does is that it's a step change in terms of our understanding of these links between plantation slavery and land ownership itself. And that's really important. It's not something we should shy away from, and it's not something we should be uncomfortable about discussing, because we need to know where we've come from in terms of these relationships to have a sense of where we're going as well. And the critical point there is, and that's in the second part of the title of the research, about legacies and lessons. And if we think about where the lessons might be and where the application of some of these findings, granted in a completely different kind of context, lie within the current contemporary period, it is very much about relationships of power and who gets to determine what happens with regard to land itself in different areas. And you can see kind of broad parallels in that regard from in relation to the issues that Andrew's mentioned with regard to the 4 Ds, and some of the issues that we as an organisation, Community Land Scotland as an organisation, are very much interested in within the context of where land reform and community empowerment and community resilience goes in future. And our land reform manifesto that we published in November of last year touches upon a number of these different themes to a greater or lesser extent. So Andrew mentioned the issue of monopoly land ownership. Well, monopoly land ownership still exists, and the important factor there as well, does that monopoly structural issue actually serve the public interest? If it does, well, that's a positive. Where it does not, there are some significant issues to be addressed in terms of public policy in that context that are within the ambit of government and parliament and other stakeholders as well. So that's a really important dimension of all this. One of the others as well is around community empowerment and also the overarching climate emergency that we're facing now. So when we're talking about the ownership and use of land in a contemporary context with regard to the climate emergency, well, there are some really significant issues there that are ongoing, that have their antecedents very much in the period that Andrew and Iain are talking about, and also kind of echo through history. So who is benefiting in terms of the investments that are being made and the incentives that are there in the contemporary period now to think about how we address the climate emergency and who benefits from that, and where is the community dimension to that. And similarly as well, when we're thinking about the sustainability and resilience of communities in the North West Highlands and indeed throughout rural Scotland, where are the benefits and who is benefiting in relation to that as well? And in that context, who determines how we value our landscapes, how they're shaped, the balance between ideas of, for example, wildland, the kind of issues that, as Andrew mentioned, were perpetuated and consolidated in terms of some of the forces that were driving the dynamics in the period under study. And how does that work in practice in terms of these balances as well? So there's a great deal in terms of what light has been shone on the influence of slavery, derived wealth and land ownership of the period from then, that actually has very important relevance, contemporary relevance, to some of the land reform debates and empowerment debates in terms of community empowerment that are very much present today and will go on, I'm sure, into decades into the future. Thank you.
Good, thank you very much, Calum, for giving us that link to today. But I want to kind of stick with that and beginning to probe some of what's being said. I'm sure there are people, perhaps not in this webinar, but there might be, but I'm quite certain there are people out there in the country at large who are saying, look, this is all very well, it's all very interesting historically, but this is all from the dim and distant past. And, you know, what's its relevance today? Isn't it time to move on from all of this and face the future, not look to the past? Now, it'd be interesting, I think, to get your views on that, and maybe Jennifer, if we could start with you, because I rather think that the National Trust, certainly at the English level, has been the subject of all sorts of dispute and complaint, if you like, amongst political parties and more widely, about what they've been doing about looking and expanding and explaining and sharing their understanding of their properties. And they've been subject to some quite vitriolic comment in some well-known journals. So has your work in Scotland been politically controversial, politically with a small p within your own membership? Well, and what do you make of this point about, look, it's time to move on, that's all in the past? And then I'll come to you, Andrew.
Yeah, I think there is a difference between Scotland and England. We've had less of that. That's not to say we haven't had a very small but vocal minority of members writing, having read articles in The Spectator or the Daily Mail, which I have posted. I've been posting some up there. And I suppose a sense of fear and obviously accusations of wokeism that we get. But I would say by and large, the clear evidence is that the vast majority of our members have been tremendously supportive of what we're doing. And my sense also with the BBC programmes is that generally people have said, I wasn't aware of that, but I'm very glad I know about it. I think the message I'm really trying to get across is that this is part of our shared heritage. Like any island, Britain has had masses of influxes of people. And I think we did have perhaps grow up with a perception that once upon a time Britain was white, Scotland was white, and actually far from the case if we read Tom Devine and realise the impact of children of mixed race, for example, who were schooled in Inverness. So I think that's clearly the case, and I'm finding lots of instances where families who are related to our properties are sending home children to be educated in Scotland. I came across a letter last week which relates to the Grant family who lived near Forres, who had 3 or 4 children sent back, one of their mixed race children, funnily enough, had red hair and ended up in the British Army working in India. So that's the tremendous richness of these stories, I think. But I think what has happened is that those kids have been written out of the history of our properties very conveniently, and we remember the one legitimate white child in the family, the one who inherited. So I think it's really, again, just emphasising the richness of that, but in a very measured approach. I think also we really need to be aware that we need to prepare all of our staff for the return of members, so that we're not regarding this as just a one-off project, but very much an embedding of the philosophy and methodology of what we're doing into every visitor experience. That's not that we're ramming it down people's throats, but we are preparing the staff and volunteers for the kind of comments they might receive, which we're reading about in the newspapers. And I think they need to be really equipped for that. So one of the wonders of lockdown is that our Microsoft Teams has taken off. And I think we're an organization that actually really benefits from working remotely, which to some degree we've always done. So I've now got a team of around 50 members of staff and volunteers who are supportive of the project. And we have a live feed that runs all the time where we're posting webinars, newspaper articles, and those from the Spectator and the Daily Mail, as well as the positive ones in the Guardian, the defences of Karine Fowler, as well as the vitriol that you described. And I think it's very good if people are properly informed about the debate. They need to be equipped for that. And I work in a consultancy where I'm advising staff to carry out various things, but ultimately beyond June of this year, they will be leading on those things at a regional level, and they will decide how they do this interpretation. So really what we're doing is equipping them for that.
Okay, thanks. Andrew, what's your thoughts on this time to leave all this in the past?
I'll try and keep it as brief as possible. I suppose my point is, I suppose I should hold my hands up immediately and say, well, I'm an historian, so what I'm about to say is probably configured by a belief that the past is significant, always with us and always will be. I suppose my answer to it is, and I have heard this said, and frankly, it's intellectual dishonesty. First of all, it's not in the past, as the payments to pay off the slavery compensation package were not finalised until 2015. There are Black Britain taxpayers today who have had their tax income go towards paying off the compensation package. So sadly, it is not ancient history. That's the first point. I think the second point is that accusation of it is all in the past, can we move on, tends to be deployed in ways that suggest a very telling selectivity. Lots of this country is perfectly willing to dwell on the past. Whole landed estates project and proclaim the nature of their great houses, their histories, their landscapes, etc. In other words, what they're saying is we want a certain part of the past to be projected and proclaimed. We don't want this bit of the past to be projected and proclaimed. That is neither sustainable practically, nor, I would argue, intellectually. I think my last point briefly to make is that let's think of this in terms of some of the points that Calum highlighted and that Jennifer and her organisation have to deal with. The bottom line is the question of a key natural and social resource in Scotland, and indeed anywhere else, is at issue here. What we do with it in the now and in the future is a policy question, an issue of law. In order to understand the best solutions, the most equitable, the most fair, that move those issues on, can only be done by an informed, critical and effective understanding of where we are and how we got here. For those three reasons, I would say that people asking about why we don't move on don't really know what they're talking about.
Okay, thanks very much. Iain, can you maybe pick up on this too? But also, we've had one question in the Q&A about why is it taking historians so long to get to this particular point in study of the Highlands and Islands, given the land question's been around for a long time? And given you're the guy that's done this, I'm not asking you why it took you so long, but generally speaking, why has it taken so long for people to address this, do you think?
Thanks, Peter. I think in terms of the first part, to add to what Jennifer and Andrew have said, is just to reiterate, as well as the principle that Andrew's just talked about, we also need to understand the practice or the historical content in Scotland, which Andrew referred to in his presentation, which is that a period in which a form of dilution of ownership could have occurred in the early 19th century that may have brought Scotland more into line with the landholding patterns of other countries in Europe didn't occur. And a significant reason for that not occurring may well have been the arrival, and I think was the arrival of wealth coming in from empire, in this case, slavery. So it's not just in principle, but actually when you examine the history, we can see that there are certain historical factors that condition and have constrained the way that land is owned, the very unequal patterns of land ownership in Scotland today. That's important too. I'm not sure that I'm the best person to ask the question of why historians haven't looked at it, because I'm not a historian, I'm not trained in history. But it does seem to me that there has been an overlooking of empire in terms of the land question in the Highlands. It's been treated as a relatively hermetically sealed. I'd be interested to hear what Andrew has to say on that, because I know his work hasn't operated in that way. His earlier work on the military recruiting shows an imperial dimension to it, and the work that he's about to publish on relations with East India. So I think it's getting there. But yes, there seems to have been a long period where it was considered sort of sealed off from that. And what I think the report shows is that really the clearances were enabled or facilitated by wealth from empire. And also, I think that land ownership in the Highlands and wealth in the Highlands also facilitated people participating in empire in the first place. So they're interdependent. They work both ways. But I'm not sure I'm the right person to ask the question on why historians haven't discussed that.
That's very honourable and honest of you, but maybe Andrew could pick that point up then, would you?
Thanks, Iain. I think that's it's an extremely good question, and I think one that would take a long time to answer. I suppose what I would point to is a couple of things. I think, firstly, the British, and indeed for that matter other national academies, really only in the last probably 15 to 20 years in particular have moved to a paradigm of understanding that empire not only shaped the colonial society out there, be it Jamaica, be it India, whatever, but that increasingly there was an understanding to be a reciprocal dynamic, that the empire reshaped the metropolitan society in general. That shift happened probably 25 to 20 years ago, and has involved a huge amount of productive good. So there needed to be a conceptual shift in the way historians thought about the empire link for the first. I think secondly, lots of areas understood a link with empire, but it tended to be thought of spatially and in particularly limited ways. Hermetically sealed was the way that Iain described the Highlands. But if you went to look at some of the great work often done by local community groups, by people with particular interests in, say, somewhere like Bristol and Liverpool, and even in Glasgow, then the slavery link was understood and the significance was understood, because in a way it was difficult in this city and environment to not confront the slave link. So in a sense, the rural areas, rural Britain, is only now catching up, and that is a testimony to how effectively the displacement, disguise and distraction strategy actually worked. The whole point is these country houses don't look as if they're imbued in empire. The whole landscape doesn't look as if it's connected to empire. And only as we began to particularly unravel the way you can follow money, which is an incredibly technical process, can we then begin to connect A to B to C. So in a sense, it's partly conceptual, it's partly methodological, and it's partly about the need of British historians working on British imperialism to learn from a lot of decolonizing initiatives in the way we think about history, who practices history, and whose history is important, so that we then think about how we need to understand that slavery is hugely important for communities in the Caribbean, but that it can equally, through these connections, be important for people in communities that tended to think it was the history of landlordism and eviction that was the most important. So it's also about reconnecting and understanding these connections in new ways. And that's a long learning process for us historians.
That's great, thanks. I noticed Alistair McIntosh has posted something too, just reminding us that it is obviously difficult to research some of these things in the context of where there's still contemporary pressure not to open up these questions and not to look back, as we've seen very recently. In fact, earlier this week, I think there was a meeting at the UK level of the Culture Minister about some of these issues with other interests. Okay, moving on then to another dimension of all this. Quite often these debates raise questions, and indeed there's been another comment in another post that's popped up, that these debates lead to questions of reparation, of atonement, of apologies, of memorials and monuments, which have been very controversial recently. Now, I don't particularly want to get caught up in that. Please feel free to make any comment you want. But it does raise a question for me of, so what's the best way to remember? What's the best way to explain? What's the best way to aid understanding so that people can make their own judgments? Now, it was interesting in the Scottish Parliament debate the other night, a couple of weeks ago now, there was one of the MSPs, at least, if not more than one, talked about, well, what do we do in terms of the interpretation more generally, not just in the National Trust properties, but more generally in the private properties that are being attractive to tourists? What do we say there? What do we say in tourism offices about that? What do we say in hotels and guest houses about what the history of this place is that you're living in? Is it a question of things being put into the curriculum of school or added to the curriculum? What do you think is the best way to begin to talk about these things and aid that wider understanding of these issues? So anybody want to volunteer on that? Maybe Calum, you want to start with that?
Yeah, I think, Peter, you're right. The debate in Parliament the other week there was quite notable in terms of the importance of thinking about how we acknowledging these issues. And I think that is the first point, actually, is just to be in a position where we can openly and maturely acknowledge these relationships in terms of what they actually entail and what their implications are for the historical lens, but also contemporary society as well. And I think there are obviously different ways of doing that. They're multifaceted. It's a complex area, of course, but one initial aspect that would be very important as well is just to open that up in terms of our educating ourselves and in relation to that. And part of that, and Andrew will have a particular view in this, I'm sure as well, is around the notion of introducing that dimension into the school curriculum, where if you're teaching history locally, you've got an understanding of that localized context as well, and the implications and ties that link the present to the past in that regard. So that would be one way of doing that. And I think as well, it is important, because it was an important point that was made earlier about the idea of history and heritage, and whose heritage is being acknowledged here and interpreted. So the idea that we actually enable that to be brought to the fore as well, whether it's by existing landowners to give a sense of what the history of the land is, and that can be in terms of community landowners as well as private ones and public ones as well, in terms of that longer term history. That's an important dimension of that public understanding of these issues as well. But there's a complex kind of set of threads and dimensions running through all of that, of course.
Okay, thanks, Cal. Jennifer, you're signaling you got.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think that it's already on the school curriculum. In fact, the Scottish Government advocate the teaching of historical slavery as an adjunct to understanding current human trafficking and making for a better rounded, more informed individual. And in addition, I think a lot of individual schools are doing amazing things. Dollar Academy is one. Finnan Primary had an HLF funded project where they created a graphic novel about the history of their school and how it was funded by enslavement. So there are lots of individual opportunities, I think, which are being realised in Scotland. And again, I think the schools are very responsive to it. I understand Fortrose Academy is another one that's looking at its historic links. James Gillespie's school, they've spoken about renaming the school. So so there are lots of individual things going on. But I think in terms of the trust, we're very keen to engage with schools, and we are looking at engaging somebody to do that through the next few years. Okay,
I wanted to move us on to another topic, if I can now. And picking up one or two comments that have been coming in as we've been talking. One is about Calum MacLeod rather is raising a point about will this debate help opening up discussion about maximum acreages that land that no single owner should own and above that level. That debate, of course, is ongoing, and the Land Commission right now have recently been publishing paperwork about the whole question of monopoly ownership and the scale and concentration of land. And I'm quite sure around that debate, this question about maximum land holdings will continue. So that's still a very live issue. And I think this debate here can only add to that. I wanted to move into some of more of the cultural dimensions of what this says to us as a society. And I mean, I'm very conscious about, and in that context, that what status we've given to landowning in our history. I was just reflecting on a story my mother told me quite recently about my grandfather, when not showing enough deference to the landowner who'd passed their cottage, was taught how to doff his cap appropriately to show appropriate deference. And you know, we've got this notion very often in Scotland, certainly I've come across it, of the idea of landowners being generous benefactors of the community. They may have left a playing field, land for a playing field for the school, or indeed for the school itself. Although I have to say, as a councillor in the 1980s in charge of Highland Region's finances at that time, we had to spend a fair bit of money buying back our own schools from landowners, because what we thought had been a gift actually turned out not to have been a gift. But there's that idea of the generous benefactor, and that perhaps is also reflected in words I know have appeared on, I understand have appeared on statues to landowners, which were these statues being erected by the grateful tenantry. And then I remember not so many years ago paying my feud duty to what I think was termed my feudal superior. And that kind of links the idea of land ownership and superiority in some way. And it's only less than 20 years ago the Scottish Parliament abolished the last vestiges of feudal tenure. So does this work say anything to us about how we either reappraise or consider these attitudes that we've had in society, some of which actually might have held back some of the reforms that people have argued for over many years, because of a fundamental attitude which tended to put, in some instances, not every instance, but would put landowners on pedestals. Andrew, do you want to pick that up from a sort of cultural dimension? Is there anything in that?
Wow, that's a great question. I suppose one of the things that we need to bear in mind about Scotland historically, and I'm actually talking about Scotland in general, not so much just the West Highlands and Islands, although it probably has a particular force in that region, in a sense can be summed up in the idea that not many societies talk about land ownership using the phrase landlord. The very phrasing we use tells you something about historically, within their own confines, Scotland had one of the most powerful intrusive landlord classes anywhere, certainly probably west of the Urals. Their rights of tenure over their tenants make them simply capable of controlling their own social communities in ways that's very difficult elsewhere, even in places like Ireland and certainly in England and Wales, because of the structure of tenure. In other words, we're dealing here with a landlord class that is so embedded in both the land, the concept of land, and above all, in making Scotland's legal system work to its economic and property advantage for centuries and centuries, that in a sense, the concept of a dominant landlord locally and a monopoly style of land ownership in Scotland has become normalized in ways that I think we have to begin to challenge. The reality is that despite being in a sense aware of the land reform issue for many decades now, the question of the landlordism issue remains something of a blind spot, both in terms of Scottish society's historical understanding and certainly its current debates. So there's an interesting question about the land reform issue and the need to deal with the landlordism issue.
Yeah, interesting. I mean, you know, the kind of things I was touching on, and there are more examples of the status we attach to landowners, of course, define the power relationship between landowners and people. I see that Justin Kenrick has posted a comment there talking a bit about the power systems that existed of monarchy, aristocracy, House of Lords, and so on, which a lot of which was caught up very much with land itself for obvious reasons. Iain, you're signaling you want to come in on this.
Yeah, just to come back to the pre-landlord system, or the more commercial system of the Balchan, where you had forms of power and local leadership that were much more highly devolved, and actually the feeling and the memory of that has continued to exist in many of the communities in the Northwest Highlands. There's a section in Jim Hunter's book where he, The Making of the Crofton Community, where he talks about how someone in Braes was saying, oh, there were bad people here, but we can't blame the landlord. The landlord was never bad to us. And then he said, Jim Hunter said, if I'd gone to Dunvegan, but this same man in Braes condemned the MacLeods for what they'd done. He said, had I gone to Dunvegan, I would have found the exact thing reversed. that there was a memory of a more devolved and perhaps more responsible forms of leadership. And the question to me then is, if that is a historical factor, if that was there and was retained in people's minds right through to basically the contemporary period, how do we create forms of land ownership today that reflect that long-standing cultural norm of devolved and responsible forms of local leadership? Because clearly landlordism, as we've had, perhaps in the aberration of the last 2 centuries, doesn't achieve that that normal condition that we can see in the longer term of the Gaelic-speaking areas of Scotland.
Okay, anybody else want to come in on that particular point? No, nobody's signaling to do that. Can I move us on then to another dimension that Andrew raised, which seems to point to the fact that at the time some of these purchases were taking place as a result of slave compensation money, or they were contributing to that rapid purchasing of land or extending estates. There was a lessening, arguably there was a lessening of concentration of ownership going on, and what happened was the slave money, in that, if I can term it that way, helped consolidate existing ownerships, because suddenly the wealth was there to hold on to them, and may have extended and therefore consolidated. And of course, these land holdings very often have been endured throughout that period of history, and the way in which land is parcelled and comes onto the market today may owe something to that, and that therefore affects how land markets operate today. But another dimension to this, I wonder, and maybe Calum could think about this and start off on this. I mean, arguably too, that the current subsidy systems around land act to consolidate current land ownership. I'm thinking of, certain tax breaks you get in certain aspects of land, forest grants, for example, which are, very readily available now, increasingly money available for peatland restoration and things of that sort, other forms of environmental support, the whole agricultural support system that's there. Now, this is not only accessible by private owners, it's accessible too by community owners and by crofters and others. But to what extent are these issues of subsidy that Andrew talked about still within the system, continuing to perpetuate this concentration of land ownership, this quite unique concentration of land ownership in Scotland, and actually acting against some of the things that Iain just pointed to about a more devolved and responsive form of land ownership that may have existed in the past. Yeah. Calum, do you want to kick off on that, and maybe come to Andrew after that?
Absolutely. I think the relationship between public funds and land is critical, and the fact that we have these this monopoly structure of land ownership helps to kind of reinforce that to a degree as well. Because if you think around the balance between public and community benefits with regard to addressing the climate emergency, well, if you're going to get investment in order to do that, a lot of that is related, not exclusively, but a lot of that is related to your land holdings already. So there's an important relationship there in terms of where that funding is drawn to and on what basis. And so there's an interesting and important question to be addressed with regard to the public interest dimension with regard to that. There's also related to that something around land rights and responsibilities. Now, we know that the land rights and responsibilities statement that was introduced in the 2016 Land Reform Act is due for review relatively soon. And there's an important dimension there about, if you like, making sure that behaviours that are linked to public investment or subsidy are actually going to deliver these wider public benefits, but also community benefits as well in the areas where they're being applied. So that's an important dimension with regard to that. But critically too, we need to ensure that we have a more diversified pattern of land ownership in rural Scotland so that we can actually deliver the public benefits, but critically as well the community benefits that are going to help areas such as the North West Highlands and elsewhere to actually become more sustainable in practice.
Okay, I think actually, colleagues on the panel, I now see that we've actually reached our allotted time, and I know that the person who controls the technology for this meeting has to move on to something else. So I'd better begin to wrap this up, I think. And first of all, I want to thank you all for taking part today and for your contributions and your insights. It's been absolutely fascinating. And I know there's a whole pile of questions that are probably in people's minds that we want to continue to answer. Just to reassure people who have posted things that we're going to save them, and all of those questions that we've not got to specifically or not picked up, I've tried to pick them up as we go, but if we haven't done so, we'll try and answer those for you. And I think this is a subject that, you know, we haven't heard the last of by any means. We've clearly gained from the research some new and fascinating insights into our history. We've got new understandings of how our patterns of land ownership have formed in that part of Scotland. I rather think that if we were to go on and look at the East Coast, and if we were to look at wider colonial activity in the East and not in the Caribbean, we would find other connections between wealth derived in those situations and how land is owned. And there's a lot of questions about the perceptions that people have of power, it seems to me, and the power relationships and attitudes to ownership questions that this all begins to open up. And, you know, we're all going to have to consider further what we do with this new knowledge and whether, in fact, we want to extend it more, and whether Andrew and Iain and other colleagues, given the interest in these subjects, you know, want to extend this research further. We can only await time for that. But also, how does these debates and this understanding influence, if at all, the approaches to further land reform? And how do those impacts on future land reform address this question of concentration, which is intrinsically caught up with the findings of this piece of work? So a great discussion started. We need time to let it play out, and perhaps, as I say, more and wider research will aid that as we go further forward. But meantime, thanks to everybody who's joined us today. Thanks to our panel. And we'll keep this debate going, and I hope that you in your own individual capacities will do that and continue to keep in touch and ask any further questions that you may want. So thank you very much, and we'll conclude proceedings there.